And good afternoon. Welcome to From Pentecost to Present, session number 12. Today is September 17th, 2020. It has been an extraordinary week in a lot of ways and continues to be. We're about a day early or late in putting this particular teaching on the air because yesterday we had Hurricane Sally coming through. I'll make mention of the fact that so far of people that we know in our circle of family and friends here at the church through the chapel community that were in the areas hardest hit by it, which would be the Florida Panhandle around Pensacola over to Gulf Shores and Orange Beach. There's been some significant property damage, but no loss of life or injuries among the people we know. So I would suggest that you just pray for all the victims who are in the path of the storm that are now in recovery mode. We also had an extraordinary event this week in that there was a signing of a peace accord between the United Arab Emirates and Israel that was brokered by the U.S. administration. So the signing ceremony was held at the White House this week. It has a lot to do with what's been going on in this course from Pentecost to present, where we have been looking at what happened to the land, the Holy Land, the physical real estate, from where our Bibles end with John on the island of Patmos, writing what we know as the book of Revelation, down to right now today, the second decade of the 21st century. We have looked at what happened to the Jewish people and what happened with Christians. How did Christianity spread? And now that we're in the modern period, the very modern period of the 20th and 21st centuries, there's a great deal of supplemental material that I will be putting on the website, on the Facebook pages, each and every session from here on in. This morning, I put several video clips from a program that was produced by Christian Broadcasting Network 5 years ago in 2015 called The Hope, the Rebirth of Israel. It's a DVD. You can find it on YouTube. You can get it from our church library. Some of you out at the chapel may have already seen that because we used it in several classes out there. And there are certain video clips from it that deal with the British Mandate period. That is where we are right now. So I'm going to have the cameraman turn the camera to the board. And we're going to talk a lot today about what happened in the 1920s and the 30s as the run-up to World War II. Now, I'll wait for him to get there. For those of you who have Rose books, I would suggest you turn in your Rose book maps to pages 172 and 173. That's your big map of the Middle East. Because that's going to be relevant to us. You see on the board, I've got our overall timeline at the very top from creation, the building of the first temple, the Babylonian exile, the life and death of Christ on the cross, the second temple's destruction, all the way down to what is still future to us, which would be Daniel's 70th week and the millennial reign of Christ, followed by the great white throne judgment and the new heavens and new earth. Below that is the timeline that we have been using specifically for this course, where we picked up this course where the Bible ended off. John at the end of the first century, the last surviving disciple, being given a message to 7 churches and being shown the revelation. He's told to write what you see, the things which are and the things that will take place after these things. He records it. He passes away of old age around the turn of the 2nd century beginning. And from there, we looked at the Roman, the Byzantine empires, Islam coming into creation and spreading across the Holy Land, North Africa, and into Europe. The Great Schism, where Christianity divided itself. Then the Crusade period, followed by the later Islamic period leading up to the Reformation going on in Europe with Christians, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire controlling the entire Middle East from 1517 to 1917. The Ottoman Turks backed Germany in World War I. Germany lost. Essentially, the Allied powers, largely France and Great Britain, carved up the Middle East. So where you see over here in blue, the 1900s and the 2000s, I have the word mandate and independence written in blue. And then below it in blue, you'll see that I have certain countries in the Middle East. And these are the dates that they are created out of what used to be the Ottoman Empire. And from 1917 forward will be called the British Mandate for Palestine. Britain in World War I had promised the Jewish people under Chaim Weizmann, a scientist who helped them develop a synthetic version of acetone. He asked for no payment for himself, but for a homeland for his people. Right at the end of World War I, you see over in brown, I have written in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. Lord Arthur James Balfour, acting on behalf of the British government because he was a British government official, issued the Balfour Declaration promising the Jewish people that at the conclusion of the war, Great Britain would establish a homeland for the Jews in the region of Palestine, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1920 and 1922, you have the San Remo Conference where it reiterates the promise of a Jewish homeland. The League of Nations is formed out of World War I. That was Woodrow Wilson's idea. The League of Nations affirmed the decision of the San Remo Conference and the Balfour Declaration. So those are legally binding, world-recognized decisions by the League of Nations. The League of Nations will fold as World War II comes into being, and in the aftermath of World War II and the discovery of Hitler's final solution, Holocaust, the world will get together and form the United Nations out of the aftermath of World War II. The period of time we're concentrating on today is the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly as it affected the Jewish people and possession of the land. You'll see one more dates that I've got written down there, the periods 1932 to 1938. In the aftermath of World War I, the Allied powers imposed some crushing sanctions on Germany for having caused the war in the first place. It was a very heavy burden for the German people. It allowed folks like Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party to come into power. They were properly elected into power in 1932. And from 1932 through 1938, Hitler begins a series of increasing persecutions against the Jewish people, increasing restrictions to where it becomes very, very obvious Jewish people need to get out of Germany. But at the same time that Hitler is increasing his persecution, the rest of the world is putting up roadblocks through immigration quotas and barring entry into now the British-controlled Mandate for Palestine. And then you'll see I've written in blue, May through June 1939 and September the 1st, 1939. I'll have the camera come back to me now because we're done with the board. But those are dates that you need to know. In the 1920s, the Allied powers that had taken over the Ottoman Empire from the Turks created largely the map that you see today. And I'm going to hold up very, very briefly the map in the Rose Book. If you do not have a Rose Book, you can get yourself a map that includes the Middle East somewhere. Essentially, you're going to have the French. They were allied with Great Britain in World War I. The French will have control over the area we know today as Lebanon and Syria. That's why even right now, with the recent accidental blow up of ammonium nitrate stored in the Beirut port area that was intended to be used for terrorism, and it accidentally exploded too early and destroyed a good chunk of the city of Beirut. That's why you saw the French president coming down to express his condolences, and you had a lot of people in Lebanon pleading with the French president to step in and do something because they no longer have trust in their own government. The French have also had a lot to say about what's going on with Syria, which for all practical purposes, Syria is no longer a free-running country. From 2011 onward, when the civil war in Syria started, the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, has been relying on Russia to keep him propped up and try to crush the rebellion. And the Russians are all over Syria. The Iranians are all over Syria. Hezbollah, a terror group that is Iranian sponsored, is all over Syria. And Syria's a mess. But the French, in the aftermath of World War I, were responsible for creating and helping carve up the countries you know now as Lebanon and Syria. That's why over here on the board, I'm not going to take you back to the board, I'll just make reference to it. All the modern day countries of the Middle East, every last one of them, is no more than 103 years old, because this is 2020. Turkey was created as a country right after the end of World War I. The British and the French took everything else, but they did leave Ataturk in charge of a relatively modern, forward-thinking, mostly secular Islamic state called Turkey. The rest of it became the British mandate for Palestine, and out of the British mandate, you had Lebanon and Syria being largely controlled and set up by the French. So you'll see some dates over here for modern countries. Saudi Arabia, the only country in the world named after a family. It used to just be Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula, and it was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. It was given to the Saud family by the British in the aftermath of World War I. So the king of Saudi Arabia, his family's only been in power for now about 85 to 90 years. Saudi Arabia was formed as a country in 1932. Lebanon was formed as a country in 1945, right after World War II. The modern day country of Jordan, which is what we see here in the yellow, we're going to spend some time talking about that one. In the Balfour Declaration, the British had promised to make a homeland for the Jews in the green section on the western side of the Jordan River, and also in the yellow section, that they immediately went back on their word and they pulled it out and created another Arabic state because the Hussein family wanted to get the Arabian Peninsula. The Muslim holy sites of Mecca and Medina are on the Arabian Peninsula. There was a contest between the sheikh of the Saud family line and the sheikh of the Hussein family line. The Hussein family line, direct descendants of Muhammad. The British gave Arabia to the Saud family, creating Saudi Arabia, and as consolation prizes, created the modern day country of Iraq for one part of the Hussein line, and the state of Transjordan. That's why we have 1946 up there. It was called Transjordan, and the Hussein family was installed as king of the new country of Transjordan. But he wasn't even from that area. He was from the Arabian Peninsula. Transjordan changed its name legally in 1949, which will be the period when the War of Independence occurred, because Transjordan is going to join with all these Arab countries that are going to attack the new state of Israel. Literally, the day it declares its independence, The next day they were bombing, the airplanes were coming in, tanks were rolling in, and there was a 18-month-long war of independence that ended up, to everyone in the world's surprise, with the Jews not only not being crushed and pushed into the sea, holding their own, but actually gaining some territory. When you see now discussions about the West Bank and the 1967 borders, border is an improper term for that. They are talking about a piece of real estate that Jordan illegally occupied from 1948 until 1967, when they joined the war on the side of Egypt and Syria and lost, and Israel was able to gain control of Judea and Samaria. Jordan changed its name in 1949, dropping the trans part, because they were going to intend to incorporate the territory that they were illegally occupying. You know it as the West Bank because that's the common popular term, but it's a misnomer. It's an attempt to hide the history. Biblically, that piece of real estate is Judea and Samaria, but they don't want to admit that it ever belonged to the Jewish people. So Jordan has two dates there. Syria, the other part of real estate that the French were in charge of, Syria was formed as a nation in 1946, and the al-Assad family took power there as dictators. Bashar al-Assad is a direct descendant of the original president of Syria because they're dictators. They don't allow for elections. Egypt was formed out of the mandate in 1953. The modern-day state of Iraq was officially formed in its current form in 1958. It had a previous form in 1924. And the country of Kuwait, and I'll hold it back up here again just for a minute. Kuwait, the little yellow dot down here, was formed as a separate country in 1969. Some of you may recall that a little over, right at 30 years ago, 1990, Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, decided that he wanted to go in and just take over the country of Kuwait outright. He claimed that it really belonged to Iraq, that it was Iraq's 19th province. And so he invaded without cause the country of Kuwait. The United States and several other countries formed a coalition, went in there and set up a defensive line in Saudi Arabia, and then finally launched Desert Storm to dislodge the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Why was Saddam claiming that Kuwait really was just a province of Iraq? Because up until 1969, there was no country called Kuwait. So Saddam was trying to basically snatch up that territory, and then he intended to try to go down into Saudi Arabia to get the massive oil fields that were there. Desert Storm prevented that. So that's your modern history, and you see now how what happened during this British Mandate period not only is setting the stage for the biblical events that are yet to occur to be feasible, but has created the situation we're in right now in the world. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler comes to power, running for office as the vice chancellor under von Hindenburg. They're elected. Von Hindenburg is quickly forced out. Some political backdoor machinations and deals force Hindenburg out, and Adolf Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. He immediately starts a series of restrictions on Jewish businesses, on Jewish people going to schools, on Jewish people being able to own property. The brown-shirted Gestapo group that he creates during the 1930s, they commit many, many acts of terror. Jews are wanting to get out of Germany. Some of them, particularly some of the ones that were in universities and serving in science positions and the arts and whatnot didn't recognize the danger they were in until it was too late. But some did, and they were desperately trying to get visas to go to other countries. Meanwhile, other countries are starting to limit their immigration quotas or flat out close their borders. Who's in control of the British mandate for Palestine at this point in time? Britain is. Britain realizes that war will come again and in the not too distant future. They thought initially that what we now call World War I, it was called the Great War then, and it was supposed to be the war that ends all wars. They very quickly realized that's not going to happen. And so Britain, watching this rising power in Germany, watching Hitler through diplomatic means swallow up parts of Europe because he claimed there were Germanic peoples living there and therefore they needed to come under German control, like Austria, the Sudetenland, various other areas. The politicians were trying to work out a peaceful solution, and what they were doing was signing treaties and deals that simply appeased the monster, made him stronger, made him much more likely to attack. Meanwhile, because the British realize war is about to come, they're going to need all that gas and oil that has long since been discovered in the Middle East. And in order to do that and to keep the civil unrest down, they're currying favor with the local sheikhs and with the few countries like Saudi Arabia that they have already created out of the sand. The British just drew the lines in the sand that become some of the modern countries. And in order to appease the Arabs, they're trying to limit the number of Jewish people who are coming into the area, fleeing for their lives because they've already been persecuted. Everywhere in the world the Jews went during the dispersion, whether it was to Europe or to what was later on called Iraq, Chaldea, Babylon area, or to North Africa, sooner or later, the political powers that be would persecute them, steal their property, limit their ability to hold jobs or to own land or do all kinds of things. We talked about the Russian Tsarist system, limiting them to the Pale of Settlement. These people are trying to get out for their lives. And at that moment, the British are refusing to let them in. So underground groups of Jewish people who were already there, who had come in, some of them had been there all along, but in larger numbers, they started coming in under Theodore Herzl and the First Zionist Congress from the 1895s into the early 20th century. And they're buying up land and they're forming the kibbutzes and they're buying really a lot of worthless swamps and desert places and making the desert bloom and draining the swamps and creating prosperity. And it's because the Jews have come in and cleaned out the land and started to make a productive crop that now some of the Arab Bedouins are migrating into that area to look for work. We have all kinds of photographic evidence and the documented testimony of people like Mark Twain, who visited the area in the 1800s and talked about how barren and desolate and overrun it was. And now it's beginning to prosper because the Jewish people, in fulfillment of biblical prophecy as described in Ezekiel 36, are starting to come home. And because they're there and they're making the land prosper, jobs are now available and other peoples are flocking to there. But the Jews can't get in the numbers that they need because the British won't let them in. So they create some underground organizations to sneak them past the British blockades, to walk in through hostile countries, to literally move house to house, hiding and looking for ways to get in and be established there. At the very moment that Hitler's rising to power and persecuting Jews, Jews are now trying to flee for their life, and the countries of the world, all of them, are either slamming the door in their face or vastly limiting legal immigration so that they have nowhere to go. And that's why I have May through June of 1939 written up on the board. In November of 1938, Hitler's brown-shirted groups went through Germany, terrorizing people. It is now known as Kristallnacht, the night of the breaking glass, where they went into Jewish areas and broke windows, set fire to places, set fire to synagogues, torched Jewish homes and businesses, because Jews are already having to wear the yellow Star of David. And it's very, very evident that these people can't remain where they are very long, or they're going to be killed. They're trying to get out, but the world won't take them. They have nowhere to safely go. A group of Jewish people were able to get visas from the country of Cuba that guaranteed that they would be able to come and immigrate there. They paid very heavy prices for these visas. They sold everything they owned. They boarded a ship called the SS St. Louis. You can look it up. In fact, I urge you to look up the story of the St. Louis. I have not downloaded this video clip yet, but I will. There is a documentary on the SS St. Louis. The ship sailed from Hamburg, Germany in May of 1939, headed towards Cuba. The captain was German. The crew was German. There were some German spies who had also booked passage on this passenger liner, the St. Louis, but the vast majority of the people on the ship were Jews who were looking to escape from Hitler's Germany and thought they had a place to go because they had the visas, they had the passports, they had everything they needed. But when they get to Havana, the German spies and the German diplomatic corps had already been at work on the Cuban government. The Cuban government refused to offload the passengers. They weren't going to honor their own visas. They weren't going to honor the passports. The captain tried. He stayed in port, tried every way he could to get the Cuban government to change his mind. But either under pressure or payoff from the Germans, Cuba refused. The captain sailed to several other ports in South America, Central America, and yes, the United States, trying desperately to get any country to take these people as refugees so that they would not be forced to go back to Germany. In the United States at the time, it required the cooperation of both the Secretary of the Treasury, a fellow by the name of Robert Morgenthau, and the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, to agree to allow the people to come in as refugees without visas. Morgenthau was willing to do so. Cordell Hull was not willing to do so. There was a third person who got involved in the whole discussion, and that was our Secretary of War, a fellow by the name of Henry Stimson. Appeals were made to President Roosevelt. He turned a deaf ear to it. Cordell Hull refused to allow the Jewish people to come in. There was nothing the other secretary, Mr. Morgenthau, could do about it. The captain was finally forced to sail back to Germany with his crew of passengers. That's in the May and June 1939 time frame. September the 1st, 1939, Germany attacks Poland and World War II begins. The passengers who were on the St. Louis largely became victims of the Holocaust because the entire world turned its back on people fleeing for their lives. It is a true story. It is a story to our national shame that our government did not do the right thing, did not do the humane thing, did not do the godly thing, and allowed that ship to be forced to have to go back to its port of origin because the captain was out of options, and most of those people died in the Holocaust. In the late 1930s, it became increasingly obvious that war was going to come. The United States at the time had a strong isolationist bloc of people voting. But Roosevelt was the president. He was going to be elected 4 times. He will die early in his 4th term in office. Roosevelt ultimately failed to act on behalf of the Jewish people. When word started to reach the Allied powers early on in World War II that something bad was going on in Germany, the Allies did not make it a priority to try to do something about it. It is in the aftermath of the war when the Allies finally invade and finally get into Germany and get into Czechoslovakia and some of the other areas that Hitler's forces had controlled, and they discover the camps and they see and document the genocide that had taken place, and they conduct the post-war Nuremberg war criminal trials. They are correct in holding Germany accountable for what it did. But they did not own up themselves to the fact that they failed to act prior to the war starting to make it less likely that people would be there for Hitler to persecute. They cut them off from their only path to freedom in the run-up to World War II. So World War II breaks out. At first, the United States is officially neutral, but obviously aiding the Allies in Great Britain and France. And then when the United States is attacked in December of 1941, the U.S. officially joins the war on the side of the Allies. When World War II is concluded, you have the Nuremberg trials. You also have literally millions of displaced people from both sides, from the Allied sides, where countries were overtaken like Belgium and the Netherlands and Norway and France. And you have people who were Holocaust victims put in the concentration camps. And you have even the Germans themselves, the German people, as a result of the end of the war, many German cities are totally destroyed because of the efforts it took to win the war. Political maps are going to be redrawn. The Soviet Union was an ally in World War II. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet Union's borders changed, Poland's borders changed, Germany's borders changed, a lot of borders changed, a lot of people are displaced, a lot of children are now orphans without being able to find or locate any living relative. There's going to have to be some plan in place to rebuild and restore Europe, and also to find a place for all these Jewish people from all different European countries to go and live. Their property was confiscated by the Nazis. A lot of Jewish property, quite frankly, still sits in Swiss bank accounts. Switzerland can't give it to the Germans who placed it there. They claim, well, we can't track down who the rightful owners among the Jewish people are because of the Holocaust. They have refused so far pleas from Israel to say, if you can't find the owners, then give it to the state of Israel and allow us to use it for the good of the Jewish people. So far, some of that stuff still sits in Swiss bank accounts. But in the aftermath of World War II, what happened? You've probably heard in American history classes about the Marshall Plan. General George C. Marshall, the supreme U.S. general in World War II, becomes Secretary of State, comes up with a plan to rebuild Europe. What about all those Jewish people, though? The Nuremberg trials are going on. Jewish people are in a lot of displaced persons camps. That's what they were called. And thousands upon thousands of them are now trying to get into British Mandatory Palestine. Why? Because in the aftermath of World War I, the British had promised the Jews a homeland. And these Jews who have gone through the ravages of World War II, now realize we have to have a country of our own. We're not safe anywhere. And they're trying to get into mandatory Palestine. But what do the British do? They slap up the blockades again because they've created a mess, but they're going to need the gas and oil to rebuild their own industry in the aftermath of the war. They don't want civil unrest with the Arabs being upset over the Jews coming into the area. So they create some detention camps on the island of Cyprus, which is right here. Little yellow blot out in the Mediterranean. They put, literally, stop and think about it. Put on your 21st century brain for a minute. Stop and think about it. Britain's response to these refugees who have gone through hell on earth in World War II is to take them out of Europe and put them behind barbed wire camps on Cyprus because they don't want to let them in to British mandatory Palestine, even though there are Jews already there who have built kibbutzes and built places and they want to receive them in. The British are putting a stop to it. Britain will have done several things in the run-up to World War II. They will convene something called the Peel Commission that was in 1937, where they try again to redraw the map, and they want to take even more of the land that they promised to the Jews and give it away. They issue a white paper in 1939 that says that they've changed their minds about establishing a state for the Jewish people at this point in time. Why? Because in the run-up to World War II, the British know we're going to need the oil that the Arabs are sitting on to conduct that war. But the Arabs won't send soldiers to fight for them. A lot of the Jews who were living in Israel at the time joined the British Army in Jewish brigades. They actually tried to limit the amount of Jews that would get actual military training. They would accept them as soldiers, but they would put them in like clerical roles and support roles because they didn't want to train the Jews how to fight. The Jews managed to do some training on their own. They managed through some friendly British officers to get 500 Jews at a time trained in actual combat. And finally, during the war, the British were forced to use that Jewish manpower to help them defeat the Nazis. And now they want to go back on their word again. So you've got all these people in these displaced persons camps, including an awful lot of young children who aren't likely to survive winter in a barbed wire camp. The Jews started to try blockade running. They would use monies that they collected from each other and try to buy whatever rickety type ship they could get to run the actual military naval blockades and sneak people into the land. There's one very, very famous incident that we're going to talk about next time called the Exodus. In fact, I would suggest to you that sometime between now and next week, you look it up. You can get that film very readily from a lot of different sources. It was an Academy Award winning film, has an all-star cast called The Exodus. It deals with trying to run the blockades and trying to get Jewish people into the area that they had been legally promised and had the British go back time after time after time on their promise to have people in place to when the UN finally will vote to partition the place and allow the Jews to have a state of their own, that they have a chance to raise up an army to fight the Arabs who are going to attack them the minute that they declare statehood. We'll see you next time From Pentecost to Present, and we'll be looking at the Holocaust and the post-war period through the War of Independence.